black and white stories keep other people in boxes, and as a result, keep us from experiencing connection and empathy with one another. Those stories keep us from doing the sacred work of building peace. Now, the purpose of the practices that Cindy shared with us is to complicate and expand the one-dimensional stories that we have about other people. And here's a reminder of the tips Cynthia gave us for how to do that. First, read and engage the stories of people who have a different experience than you from their perspective. Pay special attention to those you've been told only one story about, or you've only heard a photocopy of their story, never from their mouths, but from other people interpreting their story. For instance, like most of you, I grew up on the prairies. In fact, I grew up in Wetaskiwin, Alberta, next to one of the largest reserves in Canada. I grew up learning a one-dimensional story about Indigenous people. I had Indigenous classmates and walked by Indigenous people every day on the street, but not once did I hear their story from their own mouths. And I have had to complicate that story by learning about Indigenous spirituality and reading Indigenous authors and theologians and absorbing the stories of residential schools and treaties and the Indian Act and the unique character of each separate nation within Indigenous populations. There's so much to learn, and sometimes it's really uncomfortable because I have to admit I don't understand, or I've gotten it wrong, or because I can't make sense of things. But I have also been inspired and have reimagined what God is up to in the world because of the new stories I have heard. And I've also made new friends. So here's a really practical thing to do. Just read some books by Indigenous writers. We're going to put some on the list of resources this week so you know where to start if you're feeling new to this. And if they challenge you and feel uncomfortable, that's good, because it means you're complicating the story. And when you hear a story that complicates a narrative that you hold about someone else, rejoice. Allow the narrative to be complicated, because complication in another's story opens you up to listen and learn, and therefore opens you up to connection and empathy. Here's another helpful thing that I heard Cynthia say, but I've also heard from others. Read stories that highlight the joy and not just the suffering of others. When we hear only stories of suffering, it again creates that one-dimensional story, but it also sets up a power dynamic that keeps us from seeing others' shared humanity, because it gives rise to feelings of pity rather than respect. So read stories of resilience. Read about culture and music and food and clothing from other people groups. I've been reading a novel by a woman from Nigeria, set in Nigeria. And as she writes about the Nigerian experience, I am set back again and again to the internet to figure out what's going on. What is a mandrake? How do they prepare it? What is an adire bubu? It's a comfy shift dress that also looks beautiful. What kind of houses do Nigerian people live in? It's teaching me so much. Another practice that Cindy suggested to us is that when you meet somebody that you might find hard to relate to, or you find anxiety or fear rising up in you, ask questions that remind you of your shared humanity. Questions like, what's their favorite vegetable? Remind yourself that while we all have a different experience of the world, we also share so many things. We love, we want to belong, we want to feel safe, we want to be heard, we want to see our experiences represented in the world truthfully. Cynthia's final practice suggestion is this: resist engaging in meme culture, which just means that we resist boiling issues down to 140 characters, because life is more complicated than that. You can still share those hilarious Bernie Sanders memes though, because I love those. Take note of your social media feeds. Are they full of one side of an issue? Do you need to open yourself up to new perspectives and ways of seeing things? Seek diverse opinions and viewpoints. Slow down. I'm not a huge social media user, but I do spend a significant time on Twitter, and some of the people I follow, or most of the people, are more progressive Christians. And I have made an effort in recent months to follow more conservative voices I respect, and eliminate the progressive voices that participate in meme culture or are demonizing people who think differently than they do. So, those are the practices that help you complicate the stories that we might tell about other people. But that's a hard thing to do if we haven't faced into our own complicated stories. So here's one final practice for you. Listen to and lean into your own complicated story. One of the ways that we learn empathy is by facing into how imperfect and complicated we are, by making room in our own story for imperfection, for emotion, for wounding, and therefore for grace. Telling our stories helps us to integrate our stories and make sense of them. Camilla Gibb, who is one of my favorite authors, wrote a memoir about the breakup of her marriage. And this is what she says about telling that story. We come to know ourselves only through stories. We listen to the stories of others, we inherit the stories of those who came before, and we make sense of our own experiences by constructing a narrative that holds them and holds us tighter. Stories are how we make sense of our lives. Telling our story is a spiritual practice when we tell our stories to God and invite the death and resurrection of Jesus to reinterpret and include all of the suffering and joys. As we become more integrated and accepting of our own stories, we also become better able to make room for the stories of others. So instructions on how to reflect on and tell your story will be on our website in the resources. It takes time and space to enter into this practice. It also takes quite a bit of courage. And one of the practices is an exercise I do with our baptism candidates on how to tell your spiritual story. It includes reflecting on the significant events at each stage of your life, where you felt feelings of safety and joy, or fear and loneliness, and therefore where God felt present or absent, and then reflecting on themes or repeated patterns and creating a narrative or a picture that helps hold the complications of life. Now, we used to tell our stories a lot more in churches. It was called sharing your testimony. And today, we called it a God story when we shared about the arrival of the Preeb twins. You see, we all need safe places where we can explore and tell our stories, share our joys and sorrows, and make sense of what has happened to us, who we are, and who we're becoming. There's one other resource that I'm going to share on our webpage that involves reflecting on 2020 instead of on your whole life. It's from Alpha Canada, and the man who shares the exercise is one of my very favorite profs from grad school, Daryl Johnson. It involves reflecting on the loss, longings, fears, and hopes that arose from a very complicated year, and allowing God to meet us in the middle of those experiences.